Good morning, everyone. I don't have any slides, so you may have to look at me. The reason I don't have any slides is I can't really never decide what I'm going to say until I get to a meeting and I hear some of the other speakers. And now I have the luxury to do that because I don't work for the government anymore. Like Rita, I am a recovering science research manager, and this is something that's probably never going to leave me in my, it's now firmly rooted in my DNA. It's uncanny that this meeting actually takes place with a pretty sad backdrop of what's happening a couple of miles down the road here, up on the hill, and specifically what's happening in the R&D arena. President Obama has said that if you want to lighten the load in an airplane, the last thing you want to take out is the engine, to emphasize how important the whole R&D infrastructure will be for our country. I am particularly chagrined about the program that I had the privilege and the honor to head for about 13 years, and Rita was certainly on the advisory committee of this program, called the Biological and Environmental Research Program within the Office of Science of the Department of Energy. A program that's 63 years old, and I know it because I'm the same age, so I always had that as a reference point. And that has, in my opinion, been one of the major interdisciplinary programs across our nation's R&D infrastructure for a variety of reasons, and I will get into them because it's very important for the topic of this meeting. The program was born during the dawn of the atomic era, and its principal objective was to explore what were the impacts of ionizing radiation on human biology, as well as study the impacts of the two explosions at Hiroshima and Nagasaki on subsequent generations of Japanese survivors. At that time, it was a program that was interdisciplinary by its very known nature, because the whole program, and over the 63 years has been the case, has been embedded in the bosom of a very physical sciences infrastructure. When I headed the Office of Biological and Environmental Research, I was a little guy in the middle of the giants of nuclear physics and high energy physics and material science and chemical science and geoscience and fusion science and high performance computing, which made for a pretty precarious existence, and also for a very difficult argument for budgets when you had these giants that still dominate the American R&D world. The physicists still rule us. Evidence, all the science advisors we've ever had have been physicists. And, in the National Science Foundation, it was a rare treat to have somebody like Rita head this. And don't get me wrong, some of my best friends are physicists, as I will say. The understanding the effects of ionizing radiation in human biology, in fact, necessitated the strong interdisciplinary nature of the science that was born during those times. The coexistence that we had with the physical sciences, in fact, emboldened us and helped us sort of develop the chutzpah that life scientists had never had in the past about demanding bigger budgets and proposing bigger programs. Because we were among people that didn't think twice, asking for $12 billion to make machines that smashed particles together just for the fun of it. At that time, of course, they interpreted the research as being very relevant to the defense mission of the country, but that was just a sham. So let's be honest about it. They dominated the scientific establishment, so they had the chutzpah to demand lots of money to do these projects. So in a sense, we stole from that chutzpah from them in the Office of Biological and Environmental Research. And over the years, we pushed for interdisciplinary science that essentially stole from the physical sciences infrastructure. The subject of today's presentations are mostly on climate science, but I can't not emphasize that the Biological and Environmental Research Program launched the Human Genome Project. Since that time, others have taken credit. But if it wasn't for some of my predecessors, Charles DeLisi and David Gallus, the project would have taken much, much longer. We're the ones that had the chutzpah to push for it. And it was another example of interdisciplinary science. That's what the Human Genome Project was all about. The same thing for structural biology. I have always been motivated by interdisciplinary science, and one of the reasons I was attracted to go to that particular office, because it was an enabler in terms of discovering new tools for the scientific enterprise, as well as the fact that all the interesting and most impactful results of the scientific enterprise will be at the interfaces between sciences, whatever their sciences will be. I'm not dissing into the disciplinary sciences. In fact, they are absolutely necessary, and that's how science proceeds on an average. But the interdisciplinary aspects are the ones that have some of the most exciting applications, and as I said, some of the most impactful. One of my heroes has always been Freeman Dyson, and he makes the case about the difference between a concept-driven scientific revolution and a tool-driven scientific revolution. In the former, the concept-driven scientific revolution, you have to explain all things in new ways, whereas a tool-driven scientific revolution leads you to discover new things that need to be explained. And guess what? What is most exciting? I think it definitely is the latter, not that the former isn't important. What interdisciplinary science gives you is these new tools that helps you to discover the new things that need to be explained. I was very privileged to join the Department of Energy to help in the early days of the GCRP, as my colleague described, the U.S. Global Change Research Program back in the late 80s. And it was in a very exciting, heady times, where we started with a very, very small program, and we, over the years, made it up to a $2 billion per year program. And in the process, made some wonderful discoveries. I mean, the fact that we have 13 agencies in the U.S. Global Change Research Program, by that very fact, interdisciplinary nature became a given, because we brought people from different agencies that have different backgrounds and different priorities, and somehow we got them to work together, at least for some significant periods of time. It hasn't always been very easy and not always very successful, but over the years the success has been very significant. And in fact, despite this polarization that we have about climate change and whether it's real and whether we have our own facts or our own data, I think all sensible people, whether they're scientists or non-scientists, in my opinion, of course, know that we've gone past the stage whether this is a serious problem. It is a very, very serious problem, and now it's time to do something about it, even though we still need to study it, because there are still very many major questions that need to be addressed and dealt with. So when I joined the Department of Energy to help in the launching of the program, I made a Faustian deal at the same time while I promoted some of the programs. I knew that I was in the bosom of the physical sciences. And even though I felt very strongly that ecological research was very important, and yes, indeed, social science research was very important for the Global Change Program, I had to co-opt my political masters and the giants surrounding me that were physicists. So it was not time for me then to promote things that they would have an inherent and knee-jerk reaction that was somewhat negative. To pause just a slight digression, and it's important to note that maybe for some of my younger colleagues that's starting this program, the U.S. Global Change Research Program certainly brought this to the forefront, the issue of climate change. And following that very hot summer of '88 that some of my same age colleagues remember, that what's made it very prominent, and the U.S. Congress essentially became very aware of it. But, several years before then, in the early 70s, again, one of my predecessors as DOE started a little-known program, maybe now much forgotten, called the CO2 program, the carbon dioxide program. And his boss at the time said, what do you mean? Are we going to have a program for every pollutant, for every gas? The CO2 program launched its efforts back in the in Site 74, 75 with a $2 million reprogramming effort, and had a major workshop, maybe Harold remembers it, in Miami Beach, and issued sort of the program plan for it. And I urge you to go back and look at that 1975 program plan that covered the physical sciences, the carbon cycle, the ecological research, and yes, the social science aspects. It is almost uncanny to see the similarities of the documents that you come up today. It's a... So anyway, back to my Faustian deal. It was very, very clear back then that the focus was always going to be on the general circulation models that are used as the principal tools for climate change prediction and at the very heart of all the controversies surrounding climate change. And there were, and there still are, significant uncertainties about these models. But during my deliberations, and I was very delighted to see ultimately that the program endorsed it, there was one major scientific uncertainty. And guess what? It's still one of the major scientific uncertainties, and it is the role of clouds and how they are simulated in these general circulation models. So that gave me an excellent opportunity to steal the chutzpah of the physical scientist and propose, yes, a multi-billion-dollar program, and I'm surprised to say we've spent almost $2 billion on this program since. It was the Atmospheric Radiation Measurement Program. My colleagues wanted to call it the Atmospheric Radiation Initiative, and I said, no, that's not a right title. You know, I was and still am very, very humble. Anyway, this was a program that sought to integrate disciplines to help the climate modelers especially improve their models with respect to that particular simulation aspect. And how do you do that? At that time, there were also major climate modelers, scientists that are still around and doing incredible work, like Warren Washington, of course, one of my major advisors on the climate issue, and Rita knows him, of course, as head of the science board for NSF. But the way I succeeded in getting a fairly large program, back then at the time was $40 million per year, and over the years it's now been going on for roughly 22 years. I brought in all kinds of scientists other than the climate scientists, and that included physicists, that included people in the engineering aspects, high-performance computing, as people that were up until that time not necessarily interested in the climate problem, because, quite frankly, it was still just starting to become rather prominent and interesting. And by attracting those communities, I had the imprimatur of many more disciplines that were more respected by my political masters and the ones surrounding me than the traditional scientists that I used to go to for advice. And that was, in many ways, characterized by my soliciting input and oversight by a group that some of you may know called JASON. This is a July, August, September, October, November group of self-selected graybeards, incredibly bright and smart people, including Freeman Dyson, for example, and mostly physicists, who of course are the smartest people on earth because they know everything, and every other discipline can be explained through their wisdom and their application. At that time, they were all physicists, maybe a few mathematicians. I worked with them since that time for many years while I was in the Department of Energy, and I'm happy to say, through maybe a little bit of my influence, they now have quite a few biologists, they have chemists, and they have women, believe it or not, now, as opposed to when I was working with them 25 years ago, and however long that was. And the input that they provided, but more importantly, the political support they lended through their existence and their participation in this oversight allowed me to sell it within the Office of Science and within the Department of Energy and the Office of Management and Budget and so on. The program is still going incredibly well. It's still generating tremendous amount of data. The last that I checked was something like 4,000 open literature publications in many, many journals spanning several disciplines. In recent years, they have tried to entrain also aspects of the carbon cycle in their studies. And yes, there's been at least some progress towards trying to relate some of these science sites to the NEON sites that Rita knows. The National Ecological Observatory Network, that I've always believed in because it also entrains a lot of the genomics that I felt were very successful and very important and relevant. Another program that around that time I started that was also interdisciplinary was the Computer Hardware Advanced Mathematics and Model Physics, which was essentially bringing in the advances in those disciplines to improve the climate models using thinking machines in the early stages, massively parallel machines, exploring the mathematics of chaotic systems because there were some sense that those were very important in trying to predict climate change and the like. Again, this is not interdisciplinary across a very broad range of sciences, but it certainly represented many different sciences that up until that time did not necessarily collaborate. I have to also admit some of the not so great successes we had. And in the ecological area, we weren't very, very successful despite valiant efforts to bring in more interdisciplinary dimensions to the program. I pushed very, very hard towards the last few years that I was in DOE for a program that I was referring to as scales. And that's meant, from the genomic level, that we were making significant advances through the human genome, the microbial genome, and like Rita knows. How could we relate it to ecological scale, which of course transcends so many scales, expands, and how could you come up with programs that would bring in scientists from all these disciplines that could somehow combine into something greater than the sum of the parts? And we pushed for proposals that were ones that stressed that particular connection. Unfortunately, over the years, although we did fund some interesting work and we made some limited progress, it was not something that we could really turn into a very successful effort. So it wasn't always very successful. The FACE, the Free Air Carbon Dioxide Exchange Program, which looked at essentially the effects of doubling CO2 and their various ecosystems, that was another effort where we pushed for interdisciplinary science. And I visited Oak Ridge recently, and I was delighted to see some of those new facilities and train, in a sense, some pretty sophisticated engineering. A far cry from some of the early days where a lot of these systems, primarily because of the financial restrictions and limits, were rather primitive. So in some areas we have made progress. I will also end with the Sorcerer Expedition of my colleague Craig Venter, who many of you may know this program where he went as an avid sailor with his yacht and went around the world circumnavigating the globe, taking samples and essentially shotgunning the DNA that was picked up, and in the process discovering a whole new set of genes and enriching the databases. And an incredible new accomplishment that I funded from the Department of Energy, and I can tell you how much trouble I was always getting from OMB because of funding Craig Venter's cruises. I kept pleading with him not to use the term cruise. Oceanographers were another example where they always refused to give up on that particular term. Anyway, that also, I would consider it of relatively, I would say, limited success with respect to the interdisciplinary nature of the program the way I had envisioned it originally. I had pleaded with both Craig as well as several of the oceanographers that had been funded by DOE to collaborate on this effort, because it wouldn't be very good to know the physical oceanography components or elements of that cruise so that we can maybe map physical oceanography results with the biological results that he was coming up with. Limited success. Craig was too preoccupied with what he was doing, but more importantly, and I in some sense fault the oceanographers that felt that he was sort of an outsider. He had come in, and that he should have stood in line and waited his turn, as opposed to reaching out and collaborating with him rather than worrying about who gets the credit. So that's the gist of my remarks. I want to end with basically some of the elements, because one of the questions is, what do you do in order to succeed in this kind of interdisciplinary research? So I've written down, this was in one of the breaks here, persistence, patience, and as a science manager, I say to young people, the young managers that are coming in, be prepared to take your blows, because it's not a very comfortable zone. It's much more comfortable to be in your disciplinary stovepipe. You get together with the people that think like you and have similar careers, and you connect and you do a workshop about what's next, and it's a lot more comfortable than trying to do this interdisciplinary. So expect to be bruised often, and also pick competent scientific leaders that will help you in a lot of these interdisciplinary endeavors. And the danger there is that many charlatans are also attracted to interdisciplinary research because they can hide that way. If you say that you do interdisciplinary research, people don't know where you're coming from in some way. There's no basic way to judge you. And if you've had sort of a carpetbagger scientific career like myself, started in engineering, did some computational work, did some wind tunnel work, and then did some environmental work. Typical example, it's hard to judge people like that. So you have to make a critical judgment about the quality of the scientific leader you pick to lead an interdisciplinary effort. And then, as I did, try to co-opt as many disciplinary scientists as possible. And there are various ways to do it, but funding always helps. And then, the final one, which worked for me for many years while I was in the Department of Energy, is just seduce political leaders, especially when they are physicists, because you can charm them, you can flatter them, and eventually you'll get them to do what you want. Thank you very much.